And then we'll get going. And there we go. So thank you so much for joining us today. I am Alex Grandstaff, ASAN's program manager. And today we're going to be talking about policy advocacy, what we do, and how we do it. Next slide, please. So first off, advocacy falls in four broad buckets. This isn't everything, but this is kind of like an easy way to get your thoughts around it. When we're talking about what do we do advocacy about? So we do advocacy about laws like the Affordable Care Act or Medicaid, culture and media like the NYU Ransom Notes campaign, where or filicide, and then services like education or healthcare, as well as we do advocacy about research, which that case, it's about what kind of things that we are researching, and then how are we doing that research. Again, these are the four broad categories. We'll get into it a bit more as we go on. Next slide, please. So then the obvious question of why do we do advocacy? And there's a number of reasons we do it, but some that we want to talk about right here are do things like change the policy that exists right now like policy and practice that exists right here, right now that affects our lives. Um, Change things further down the road by building power. We do advocacy to build community and to make our voices heard. Because the thing is, even once a policy is in place, like if a law comes into practice, that doesn't actually mean that the law might be enforced in ways that are actually protecting our communities. So sometimes we have to do some work. We have to advocate to make sure that all that effort we put in to get a law passed goes through and makes positive change for our communities because we deserve better. We deserve to have safe, thriving, happy communities. And that's part of what advocacy work is for. And it's worth doing. Next slide, please. So a way to think about advocacy is what and why we do it helps us decide how we do it. So in other words, what we want to happen, why we want it to happen, helps us decide the method that we want to use to advocate for our communities. And this, we're going to go into a short list. This is not every single way possible to do advocacy ever. These are some examples we can give y'all. Next slide, please. So first we have direct action and direct action in legal forms. And direct action is a way that you can spark press and media coverage. It's a great way to start getting community involved because an important part of direct action is it's public. It's a thing that's visible, that gets people talking who may not have been aware of the issue that you want people to make change on. It's a important thing to understand, though, that the risks for direct action are different for different people, depending on things like race and disability, immigration status, that sort of thing can impact how safe it is for someone to do direct action. And that's important to think about when you are planning that kind of work. It's also important to keep your asks simple, direct, and clear. It's the thing of, say, you want people to research the issue by Googling it. Maybe you want people to stop donating to a particular company. Maybe you want people to call your local mayor, call your city council, that kind of thing. And when we're talking about legal direct action, that means I can give an example that happened in my community a few years ago of one, and this is similar of a lot of college campuses will have a location where you can come and protest. As you can see, like this example signs we have here, a lot of these folks, the places they're protesting, like the one in the bottom corner there, they're standing on the sidewalk. A local protest that happened years ago. Um, excuse me a second, I need to get a drink of water. A local protest that happened years ago after the death of Eric Garner. It was a police brutality case, if you're not familiar. The protest was done on public sidewalks because the public is allowed to occupy public spaces. And that protest was very careful to maintain the space on public land of the sidewalks and not step out into the street or step onto private property. That was a strategy that the organizers of that protest used to reduce the risks of police intervention, the police getting involved. So those are things to think about when you're doing that kind of direct action. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about another type of direct action, which is civil disobedience. And I want to lead here that civil disobedience is a form of direct action that may not always be fully legal. And I'm going to talk about some of those tactics, but I need to be clear that ASAN cannot endorse breaking the law. And if you're planning to use civil disobedience actions, I strongly encourage you to plan ways to keep people as safe as possible and also prepare for legal consequences like police getting involved, arrests happening. Make sure that you have thought about those kind of things if you want to do civil disobedience. And also make sure that you are doing things like, so in that case, like if you can think about all of those steps and all the possible things that could happen. So if you think that arrests could be possible, making sure that you have a network set up to make sure anybody who gets arrested, do you have funds to help people get out of bail? Do you have a system in place to make sure that you know what has happened to your members of your protest and that you can make sure they're safe and get them out of jail? Also, when you're doing this work, this has been going on for a long time. Please historically research direct action elements that have taken place. As you can see, like some common tactics have been historically, like I actually really like direct action, so I have many thoughts on stuff you can research, but I really suggest like checking out historical examples, for instance, going all the way back to the civil rights movement, in which Black activists in the 1960s were like, they were violating the law by sitting at the front of the bus or dining at the lunch counter in restaurants that refused to serve Black diners. We also have civil disobedience actions that have not initially been planned, like one of the most famous ones in the LGBT community is the Stonewall riot, but there is also the Cooper Donut riot and many others that initially were spontaneous because of police attacking LGBT people, particularly trans people, and folks reacting. And then that from that initial riot, things became more organized. So I strongly suggest researching various history movements and also contemporary movements, not just here in the United States, but globally. For example, I would suggest a lot of protesters who are interested in the United States in learning various direct action motions. Actually, we looked at what protesters were doing in Hong Kong throughout from like 2019 to today. Also, you can check out in 2024, Venezuela had large scale protests in response to the fact that their election had been interfered with. Um, and by interfered with, I mean people's votes, like people's votes were not being addressed fairly, and folks felt concern about that. I would also check out stuff that's happened in Mexico, where there have been multiple times where protesters in the recent years have addressed issues around abortion, but also around transgender rights by directly engaging with their government. You can also look here in the United States at things like out in Georgia, there's a movement called Stop Cop City. I would suggest checking that out if you're interested in things around civil disobedience. And again, I strongly want to remind you that we cannot endorse any kind of work that involves breaking the law. If you are interested in doing stuff around civil disobedience, I strongly suggest you explore what work is being done in your community and explore researching this stuff historically, because it is a long practice that has been in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're getting into media advocacy. And we have some examples up here. For instance, the article on left and right. The article on the left side is Changing Minds. It was an article about different autism organizations' stances on autism. Then in the middle, we have Words Apart, which is an article about the differences between ASAN and Autism Speaks. We also have an article about a protest that was done by ASAN against Autism Speaks in Ohio. And then you see down in this lower corner, that is ASAN's, excuse me, excuse me again, former executive director, Julia Bascom. That was an article about including autistic people in advocacy conversations. Media advocacy can use these traditional routes of think magazines, local and national newspapers, reaching out to news anchors at your local news stations about issues that you feel like you want to have coverage and you want to be interviewed for, reaching out to radio stations. It can use those traditional forms of media that I think a lot of people think about. It could be about sending op-eds to your local newspaper to be published. You can also use, though, in today's age, social media. So think about YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. Those can also be places to get your message out. Also, things like podcasts. The thing I also want to encourage you to think about is, especially when you're thinking about engaging with either journalists who have a particular issue that they like to focus on, or if you're thinking about things like podcasts, don't just focus on, if you're doing disability rights advocacy, you don't just have to focus on folks who are only covering things relating to disability. Think about folks who are also doing work that might be focused on a different issue that also deal like that it also affects the disabled community. And that cannot be an opportunity to reach a larger audience and also do community education. So for example, that I will often do disability rights work in LGBT spaces, and I will often do that work in reproductive spaces. And in the disability community, I will often do work that's related to reproductive freedom as well as LGBT rights. Like there's overlap because disability affects all communities. So it's really important to think about that when we are messaging and when we are doing media advocacy. Next slide, please. So pressure advocacy. Pressure advocacy is typically very public because it is similar to like when you're doing a protest, you want to get more people involved, more people aware, because then they will start to and get them to care about the issue too and see how it affects their lives and their communities. So they can help you put pressure on whoever it is that you want to take action. In this case, it is often your government representatives. So for examples we have here are in 2018, we did a petition that emailed the FDA directly. Um, and that's a really effective way to do a petition. And basically the FDA got an email every single time there was a new signature. And there were over 290,000 signatures total in that petition. So that meant there were 290,000 emails. We then delivered those printed out, as you can see in the photo on the right, to a meeting that we went to with the FDA, and we repeated our demands. And then over the next couple of years, we continued to talk to legislators, who then those legislators put pressure on the FDA. And there were multiple letters sent by Congress to the FDA asking them to pass the legislation that we wanted. Then in 2019, for the 5-year anniversary of an FDA hearing that found, and for, I realized I got ahead of myself. This particular protest and petition was about banning skin shock devices and the use of skin shock devices, particularly at the Judge Rotenberg Center. And so then in 2019, on the 5-year anniversary of an FDA hearing that found that those skin shock devices were ineffective and harmful, we had a day of action. And that action included people all over the US working together to show the FDA through emails, phone calls, social media posts, and also real life wait-ins in official offices that we were still waiting for them to release the rule that would end the use of those devices. So this is one of those things where, as you can see, it can be a very long haul, like because like there was a that was we did that on the 5 year anniversary, and that was a year after we had submitted the protest in 2018. 2019 is the anniversary. Um, this is a method that you can use over a very long period of time because, as we talked about at the beginning, unfortunately, sometimes advocacy work is a marathon in the sense that it takes a very long time to get change into action, and it can be a lot of very small steps to get you there. So keep that in mind. And then we have, next slide, please. Now we're at policy advocacy. And policy advocacy is what we're here to talk about today. And policy advocacy may not always be the answer because there's a lot of different ways to get stuff done. And policy advocacy is a tool in your toolbox. And the important thing is to learn when you need a certain tool. So you might use policy advocacy alongside things like media advocacy and pressure tactics. Next slide, please. All right, so first off, what is public policy? Public policy is focused on what the government has the power to do and how the government spends our tax dollars. In general, when we're doing public policy work, those are the decisions that we can ask them to make. Next slide, please. So we're back to a place where we have 4 buckets here. When we're talking about public policy advocacy work, we are talking about trying to get folks to make changes on laws, like making a program or a rule or deciding what the government pays for, regulations, which regulations tell various government agencies like how to follow that law. Research says how research is about, in this context, is about whether a program is working, how that program is working, and also who is being funded for that research. So when we're doing advocacy work on that, maybe we want the money to be going to a different place. Maybe we want the focus to be somewhere else. Oftentimes in the context of autism research, we're pushing to have more inclusion of autistic self-advocates at all levels of the research process, and we're pushing for the focus to be on issues that directly impact the autistic community, as opposed to issues that we feel like are really harmful to the autistic community, such as research on cures for autism. We don't want funding to go to that. We want funding to go to stuff that will actually improve the lives and well-being of autistic people. Practices are about how we make sure the promises in that program, in various programs, happen. So in other words, practices are how things are actually put in place, and advocacy can be about this practice is not actually working, it's harming us, or maybe this practice could do better, or maybe this practice is great and we want it to be expanded so that everybody's doing this practice and not just a few various, like maybe a few states are doing a practice that we think works really well, and we want all of the states to do it. So those are some different examples there. Next slide, please. So looking at another example, let's talk about the HCPS settings rule. So the HCPS settings rule emerges out of the law Olmstead. Olmstead was a Supreme Court decision about the Americans with Disabilities Act. It said that the ADA means people with disabilities have the right to live in the community. So from that, we go into regulation. Regulation says that regulation brings us the settings rule, which is a regulation that says what living in the community means. Then we get into research, where then the research is looking at whether or not service providers are respecting people's rights and then that brings us like, to me anyway, these things feed each other, like flow into each other, kind of like steps. Because from research, then we can go into place where we go into the practice. And practice makes rules that give people ways to get help if their rights are not respected. So that's an example using the HCBS rule. And next slide. All right, so now we are looking at the policy process. And I would love to tell you that you do the advocacy work, you get the policy in place, there's like strong research happening, the program is good, and like the practices are solid, and everybody's happy, and you never have to go back to that particular subject. You can move on to the next thing. But I would be lying to you if I told you that's how this works, unfortunately. Um, when we are talking about policy advocacy, it is not a one and done. We often have to continuously pay attention to how a policy is being put into practice to make sure that people are being cared for as they should be, the protections are in place as they want, as we want them to be, and stuff's not getting pulled back into a place where things were not good. So when we were thinking about that process, one is setting the agenda, two, the policy is designed, three, you're pushing for that policy to get passed into legislation, into law. And then that policy, that law goes from being passed to then that it gets put into action. Then as that policy like is out in the world, actually impacting how work is done, we're checking on it. We're watching, monitoring it. So we're watching it. We're evaluating it. So we're looking at it and going, is this working? Is this not working? And then from that, we go to number six, where we're making changes. Like maybe we're looking at it and we're seeing this spot over here in the practice is not as good as it could be. Maybe there's a lot of people on waiting lists to get services. Maybe the services are missing a whole section of people. Maybe it's just not meeting needs as we thought it would. So then we have to go back and make changes. And that can look like circling all the way quite back up to one, but up to two, where maybe we want an amendment being a change to be made to the policy. So then we go back to legislators, to the government, and be like, we want you to change this policy. There's a problem here, and we think this can fix it. And then we kind of end up going through that whole thing again. We push for support. We get it passed. Then we look at it again to say, did this change fix the problem? It's a long process. Um, Next slide, please. So also, as I've said, this is a long process, and that's why it's really important to remember that good advocacy requires relationships. Advocacy work is not done by a single person. There is, we are not individual superheroes. We are a collective group, and that is how we get stuff done. And that is also how we protect ourselves as individuals and as a community from becoming burnt out and overwhelmed. We make relationships, not just with each other, but with folks who may have the ability to make the changes that we want to happen, or folks who have a common, who also want these changes to happen because it benefits their community as well. So those relationships also take trust. We can't just make a relationship with somebody solely based on like, hey, I know I need your help if I want this to happen. That doesn't work, especially when we're thinking about making relationships with other members of our community, other folks who are doing grassroots work. That's not that's not like a reciprocal relationship. It's not a relationship where we're working together. Um, and it's built on support. If we're just looking at other people as a way to help us get stuff done, that won't feel good and that won't get us there. Um, Sometimes a relationship can be a short one. Maybe we are only working together on this one issue and we don't really have that much else in common, but like we know, like, hey, You want this to happen. I want this to happen. Together, our groups will work together to get this done. And if in the future we have something else that we like that brings us together, we know we can do that again. But some relationships are long term, where maybe you're bouncing back and forth on, like, maybe you have a lot of issues in common, so you're just working together over and over again. Or maybe it's a thing where your issues are not exactly like the stuff that you care about is not exactly the same, but they overlap quite a lot. So you are frequently coming together to work towards your goals. Um, Also keep in mind, good advocacy requires information. This is not just for your, like, from a internal standpoint of you want to know, like, you want to know as much as possible about your issue. So that includes what's been done about that issue before, who are the major people who have been involved in that issue, who are the people who are opposing, like, who are opposing what you want to happen. And thus you might have to like work against in order to, and like, what are those people saying about that issue? Um, but also though, like, knowing that information can help you make your argument when you are speaking to other people and trying to get them involved and working with you. Knowledge helps people take you seriously, and being informed will help you make policy that will work in real life. It is it is not a good idea to create policies that impact communities that you are not working with. Like, the people who will be impact, who a policy will affect the lives of, should be involved in making that policy because they're going to have a better understanding of how that issue impacts their life, what stuff they might need, what that policy should cover to actually fix a problem or make things better in their lives. Um, that's what we mean when we say people who know an issue well should lead on that issue. Lived experience matters. It's not just about somebody has education on something. Do they also have they also directly experienced it? That matters too. Next slide, please. Also, I realize I'm talking about a lot of work. I won't pretend that advocacy work in general is not easy. Um, it is about it's about having really hard conversations a lot of the time. It's about looking at problems that are often very big scaled and figuring out, how do I break this big problem down into a way that's small enough for the group I am working with to make an impact? Or how does my group work together with other groups so we become a bigger, like, a bigger force to tackle this issue? And all of that to say, don't get discouraged. Don't expect thing. And part of ways I feel like for me personally, learning not to get discouraged means don't expect, like I said before, don't expect like, okay, we've made the change and now we'll never have to worry about this again and we can go look at something new. Um, don't do that. I'll be very honest. I personally don't recommend doing that. I recommend um holding, like, find what don't lose track of what has motivated you to do this work, because you will lose more often than you will win. And also for every campaign, like, make sure that every campaign you do is building your organization. It's getting more people involved, it's strengthening you. So even if you do lose that round, you've still gained more relationships, more people, and also have learned stuff that can help you win more in the future. And again, part of keeping part of keeping your heart protected and intact is also staying connected to the things that bring you joy about your community, that are the reason why you fight for people, for these changes. Think about, like, the people, the relationships that you have, and remember the fact that we all deserve a better future. We deserve to live in community. We deserve to have protections that allow us to thrive, to experience, to have ease, our lives be easier, to have our lives be safer. Um, and I encourage you to still, it sounds so lighthearted to be like, still have fun, but have fun. Remember that you care. Remember why you care. Don't get so caught in doing the work of advocacy that everything just feels like work, and then it becomes too big of a heartbreak when you do experience a loss instead of a win. Remember the things that bring you joy. Next slide, please. So, how do we set policy priorities? There are often a lot of different things to care about, and we can't do everything. So, it becomes the question of how do we prioritize? Um, so, we're going to get into that a bit. Next slide, please. So, step one is identify the issue. What do we care about? What are the root issues underneath that thing that we care about? And how does this connect to other issues? And then once we've identified that, we can narrow it down into what are our resources, strengths, and weaknesses? What are other groups doing? Where and how can we have the most impact? Again, this becomes a thing of there's no individual superheroes. There's no there's also no individual team. This is advocacy work often spans, maybe it spans your entire city. Maybe it goes through your whole county, but oftentimes it will go through your whole state and also maybe your whole region. I live down in the South. There's a lot of organizational work that will extend across our states. Um, but thinking like you can't when I am working in my communities and I'm organizing with groups in my city, we can't think about like, oh, we alone, our little group is going to do something that affects the entire South all by ourselves. What we are doing is we narrow it down to look at what can our group do, and then how can we link up with other groups so it creates an effect that like spreads through that whole region. How can we work together so we are all working smarter, not harder? Like that is highly like I really recommend when you are doing policy priorities. And especially if you're new to this, really make sure instead of immediately trying to start your own group or start a project all by yourself or just with like a small collection of friends, check what's going on in your area. Check who's already doing work around that issue, whatever it may be. For instance, I can speak personally about something that I care about. Um, I wanted to be involved with making sure my unhoused neighbors in my community were getting fed. And I looked into it and I found that there is a chapter of an organization called Food Not Bombs in my community. So I was able to connect with them because they were already doing a lot of work to make sure that people were getting meals several times a week, but also getting access to things like clothing, things like blankets, especially in winter. Um, don't feel like you have to do everything by yourself. And also do your research anytime you have an issue that you care about, do your research and see who's doing work already, because I'm fairly certain, even if there's not somebody in your town, there might be someone in the town over, there might be someone in your, excuse me, your county or the county over, or there might be someone even in your state if you need to go out. But don't automatically think that you have to start all by yourself. Next slide, please. So let's circle in to ASAN. And what does ASAN believe? We start with our values. So ASAN believes that everyone has the right to live in community, make our own choices, have bodily autonomy, be safe, be included and treated fairly, be heard, and be ourselves. And everyone means everyone. And the reason why we name these values is our values help drive our work. as an organization. And I think it's really important to do that. Not just if you are part of a group, I think it's really important that your group gets very clear about what are our values? What do we believe? And starting with the beginning of a sentence like ASIN has by saying like everyone has the right to, it can be a good jumping off point. You can do that with your group, but you can also do it as an individual because if you know what you believe is like what you value, what you believe is important, that can help you find other people and also organizations that match you on that. And if they match you on that, that can be a really good starting point to build relationships, to get to do work that feels fulfilling, that is in line with what you think is important. And that can do a lot, not just to meeting your goals, but also preventing you from feeling lonely or disheartened or overwhelmed when doing this work, because you're doing this work with people who also understand and think about it the same way you are. And I want to also be clear, they might think about it the same way you are, but the approaches might be different. And that can be really important too. That's why it's important to start with the values and then allow the like what's important to you to help you figure out, okay, this is what's important. How do we get there? And that can give you freedom to be open to the idea that there's many different ways to get to what you want to happen. Um, yeah, next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about, as we wrap here before we open up for questions, ASAN's policy priorities. So ASAN right now is prioritizing healthcare and services policies. So that can look like, as we talked about earlier, HCBS. That also looks like Medicaid. Then we have stuff about self-determination. And self-determination is a very fancy way, I feel like, of saying people have the right to make choices about their lives. And that includes their health care, where they go to school, where they go to work, but also really like what we think of often, I think, is small choices that are everyday things of when you get up, when you go to bed, what you eat, what you wear. Self-determination is the right to have control over your own life. We also prioritize civil rights. This includes things like workplace protections, protections and right to education, rights to housing. And then we also prioritize the autism community, and in particular, autism research and autism representation. Are autistic people being included in research, or is research just sort of being done about us without including us? Same thing with autism representation. Are people talking around us without actually including us, or thinking like, again, without actually including us? And even if they're including us, are we having a say? Do we have any power in those situations? Or are we just involved in a way? Forgive me, I'm going to use personal phrasing that might sound a little rude, but are autistic people involved in this in a way that we have the ability to make choices and actually have an impact on what happens? Or are we being involved in a way that kind of makes us a mascot instead of somebody who actually has power and say? Because that's, if we're just being treated like we're mascots, that's not actually representing us and that's not involving us. So yeah, those are ASAN's policy priorities. And we're going to go to the next slide because now we get to open the floor to questions. And let me see. So folks know, you can pop questions into the question and answer box, and I'll read them out loud. We have a question here that says, how do we carry out public policy in an era where the ruling majority seems to incline to distrust experts on principle and sees discrimination as good, actually. Actually, sorry, hang on a sec. My colleagues are in the chat. I think we can, let's stop screen sharing for now. Just so, there we go. Elliot, this is a question that comes from a participant named Elliot Clark. This is a really challenging question. I'm going to be very honest. I think this is a time and place in which it's always good to be incredibly strategic and thoughtful about how we are doing public advocacy. Um, and I think that's important now as well on another level. Um, I will speak a little bit from a personal standpoint. I believe right now it can be very helpful to diversify. Remember, we talked about the different types of advocacy earlier. I think now is a time to sort of spread out the different types of advocacy that we do. But when we're talking about public policy advocacy, I know it can be overwhelming to see so many changes happen very, very fast and changes that are happening in ways that that hurt a lot of different communities at once and sort of pull our attention in a lot of different directions. Um, sorry, I'm working through my phrasing. I can be a little bit crude, so I'm trying to be very polite in my words. Um, I think a thing to do can be actually to focus locally sometimes, particularly if we feel very overwhelmed, circling down into our communities and thinking about what's advocacy work that we can be doing in our city, what's advocacy work that we can be doing in our state, and how, like, it's not saying ignore, say, what's happening with federal advocacy, like advocacy that spans the whole country, but seeing how things kind of come down from the federal level to impact your state and your community and getting involved at the local level can actually do a lot of work. Um, for example, um, I live in a city that has a very big immigrant population. Um, and a thing that can be done is locally working, like on that front, like locally working with my communities and the folks who are already doing, because there's a lot of advocacy work already here. So getting involved to make sure, like, how can I be of service to that? How can I, like, be in connection with my neighbors? How can I make sure that folks are protected, that folks know their rights in the workplace, their rights at home, um, things on that front. I recommend, like, yeah, that is kind of, I realize that's not a simple button up answer that offers, it's not a magic answer. It's a small steps answer. Also, hang on a second. Okay, yes. And also, I want to read out, Dean has shared, and my coworker Dean has shared in the chat, a recommendation as well of pressure advocacy can be very useful at times like this because it's harder to ignore sheer numbers. Getting involved with work that organizations like ASAN are doing with action alerts is great, but local organizing cannot be discounted. Yes, that's also really important. I know it can feel, when we're talking about the national advocacy work, I know it can feel super disheartening. It can feel like nothing is happening when you are calling your legislators every day or emailing them every day, but that matters. That's part of the pressure. If a representative is getting emails from everybody in their district every single day or getting phone calls every single day, and those phone calls can have their constituents, people who live in their district, saying, hey, I'm concerned about A, B, C, and D, and I would like you to do X, Y, and Z about these things. That adds up. That creates pressure, and that pressure can motivate change. So I know it's rough, but that's that's the suggestion I have. Um, and then I want to go on. I see a couple other folks. Charles has said, I'd like to ask what research do, and I'm wondering if you know the book One Life, Live It. Um, I I am not familiar with that book. Other members of the team, maybe. Um, and I'm not entirely certain. I can read your question a couple different ways. So if you're asking what research does, in terms of advocacy work, so legislation and laws are often influenced by research. And ideally, like in the best case, we want research to be done that includes the community. That like if a law is, so let's focus in on disability rights. If a law is meant to change how home and community-based services are given to the disabled communities, then we want that law to be like the research that makes that law happen, to be done with people with disabilities. We want people with disabilities to be part of figuring out what questions are asked for the research. Excuse me. Excuse me again. We want people with disabilities to be involved in deciding what the questions are that research asks, because research, when it's made, is made around a question. Um, we want people with disabilities to be involved, like the ones who are being asked about, like if that research is meant to inform like what services people might need in terms of home and community-based services, or how those, like what is the best way to deliver money to those services. Like we want people with disabilities because they are the ones who will be receiving the services, need the services. We want them to be involved in that process. We don't want to be asked at the very end once all of the research has been done. We want to be involved at the front. So that's kind of the concern about research when it comes to policy advocacy. And that's kind of what research does is the, sorry, I'm like moving my hands around. Um, the research, the research gives the government something to build off of when they are creating policies, and also then when they are creating the program. We really don't want a program to be made just sort of out of thin air based on some person's idea of what they think would be good. It's great to come up with an idea, but an idea has to be tested and it has to have information to back it up. If you have the idea and then information is gathered and it turns out doesn't make any sense, like your initial idea does not work in the community, doesn't make any sense to use, then you need to go back and change your idea to actually create a program that will work. Um, please let me know if I've answered your question, or if you were instead asking more about like what research you can do. That's a question that I can't fully answer, because I'm not sure what you're interested in. That is, if we're thinking about what research we want to do, I highly recommend with like a thing I do all the time with myself is actually a combo deal. Um, I'll research things that I already know that I care about and I want to learn more about. But also every once in a while I'll come across like that's social media is sometimes good and sometimes bad. A good thing that I like about social media is sometimes I will see in my feed somebody talking about a historical event, and oftentimes there'll be a historical event that's relating to advocacy that I had no idea about. So I'll go and look it up. Um, and then usually, even if that event took place really far back in the past, there's often sort of like a bunch of events that then lead me to the present. So I can go down this whole rabbit hole and then I learn more. Maybe I learn more about skills. Maybe I learn more about stuff that's been done in the past that we aren't widely taught about in schools. Um, but oftentimes I find that still serve that still serves me well. It still um, expands my ideas about advocacy, expands my ideas about how I can support my community. So that's my answer there. And then we have another question. Hang on. So Camia said, is there any value on approaching key representatives in an individual manner first to understand what would their mental blockages be against policy change demands? Do you know any cases where that happened and helped? Um, I do actually think there is value there. I think there is value in I know I keep throwing the word strategic around like confetti, but being like having a strategy about it, I think is important. Um, so, for example, there are, um, if my teammates remember the websites that I'm going to reference, please drop them in the chat for everyone participating to see. But there's a lot of different websites that exist that you can look up representatives histories on terms you can also just go to a representative's website to see how they have voted in the past on things, issues that they say are important to them, um, and like committees they might be on, that kind of stuff. And I think that can give a good sort of foundation if you want to meet with your representative's office individually. And also, so you know, oftentimes when we meet with our representatives, we don't actually meet with like whether we're talking on a state level or a national level, you're probably not going to meet with your representative themselves. You're going to meet with a member of their team. And members of their team are actually really important folks. They are the ones who will actually become your allies in this work. And it is good to be like be considerate and respectful of their time when you do meet with them. And especially if they're like especially when you're trying to work forward and build that relationship. But like knowing that representative's previous history and using that as sort of like a way to build common ground that you can then like explore because that is honestly a lot of the policy work that ASAN's policy team does is relationship building where we kind of connect the dots for representatives of we know you really care, like say, for example, we know Representative A that you really care about um, children and families. Um, we appreciate the fact that you've voted in these ways on policies that expand programs like WIC. We would love to talk to you more about this policy over here that is about, I'm just going to keep using HCBS, Home and Community-Based Services here. We would love to really talk to you about um, how you might be feeling about this upcoming thing with HCBS and how that does relate to supporting families with young children, and how that particularly children with disabilities. Um, that can be like having that meeting and then getting to have that conversation because those represent like the staffers of representatives will probably be open with you. To us at least to a certain level will probably be willing to explain to you of like, well, we have a budget, like Representative A has a budgetary concern about budget and spending, and that's why we're not supporting that policy, or feels like this policy is distracting from this thing over here. And then you can kind of build from there. And also in that meeting, if they ask you questions and you don't know the answers, it's okay to stop and be like, I don't know that answer right now. but I want to answer your question. Can I please have contact information? And I will get back to you with that. Um, I don't know. I can't name specific cases off the top of my head. I do know that this is a regular occurrence. Um, Again, both on state and national levels. I was working in state level. I live in Texas for everyone's context. I was working in state level advocacy, particularly around domestic and sexual violence previously a few years back. And we did actually, um, my organization, along with several other organizations throughout the state, did talk to state representatives and managed to get change in order to get buy-in in terms of getting better funding for for particularly shelters as well as programs that supported domestic violence survivors. So it does happen. It's important, I think, when you're doing that kind of strategy. Um, I think a helpful tool can be when you're building a strategy like that, where you're trying to talk to representatives who might be opposed to the work, like might not be on the same page with you yet. Um, the Midwest Academy Strategy Chart is a tool that I actually really like. It helps kind of break things out into like different columns that you can then fill out and think about. Because there might be that deal with first dealing with the key representatives. Because you and your group are not the key people who can convince that representative. Maybe you actually want to come sideways because you know this representative works very closely with like Representative A works really closely with Representative B over here. And Representative B is already on board with you about this issue. So you can build a relationship with Representative B and ask them to be like, hey, can you help us? We don't know what, like, can you help us understand? Do you have insight? Like, do you have an idea of why Representative A is not on board about this policy? And do you could you maybe talk to them about it with like for us or with us? That can sometimes be a strategy of instead of going directly to A, maybe you go to B, and B kind of helps you bounce. Um, I hope that helps. If you have a follow-up question, feel free to pop it in here. And then I'm going to go down to Emily has asked, do you think civil disobedience would be effective right now, given the current people in power? So I'm going to open with the disclaimer again of ASAN cannot endorse anything that involves breaking the law. Uh, and also ASAN is a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization. I just have to, that's disclaimer right there. But when we are talking about civil disobedience, um, in a circumstance where we are not sure whether it will be like how it will be received or whether it will actually work. It's really important for us to be when we're doing civil disobedience stuff. Once again, it is the thing of we got to be very careful about risk and think about how much um, who is taking on risk for themselves when doing the work and what that risk is and how can we kind of put up protections to reduce that risk because we probably won't be able to completely eliminate it. And also we have to be intentional about what kind of civil disobedience we want to do and how do we think it would be effective. And there's a lot of different options. So I think it's important to think about what is your goal? Is your goal to change a very specific policy? Is your goal to obstruct, like prevent certain things from happening or slow down certain changes? There is a phrase that I'm going to say, malicious compliance is a phrase that I believe I'm going to explain it correctly. Um, it's a form of civil disobedience that is sort of hidden. Like it's not as obvious, but it's essentially a way of slowing down. Um, unjust practices that might be in place. And it's but basically a way of like malicious compliance is one way of doing it, where basically it's the thing of like following things to the very, very like to like following rules very, very tightly in a way that actually slows things down. So say there is an a policy that you feel is unjust and hurts vulnerable people in your community. And maybe you're a clerk at an office and somebody, like some authority figure, comes in and demands that you give information um, and cites this unfair rule. But the organization that you are a clerk for, that you like work at the front desk for, has very like a very clear paperwork procedure that needs to happen before you pop like you give out information. So for example, like let's pretend you're at a healthcare office actually. Healthcare offices, that involves HIPAA. HIPAA is a policy that protects our healthcare information. It's very, very like it's very, very strict. And I'll be honest, I don't know the exact full rules that involve HIPAA, but I know that like the enough bit I know is if anybody cannot just come in off the street, even if they are a person of authority, and say, "Hey, I this person I believe is a patient at this doctor's office. I want their medical records." You as a clerk can then follow malicious compliance, which means I'm going to follow the rules to the letter, um, and say, "Well, under HIPAA, I can't just give this to you. You need to come back with forms A, B, and C." And that is a tactic of civil disobedience that doesn't necessarily seem like it's that, but it slows processes down. Um, there, you can actually look up, there's a long history of individuals and organizations using tactics like that and see like sort of figure out what feels like the best move for you. And that's, I think, an important thing of I want to ask you to circle back to the values bit. What are like what's important to you? And also what are your goals? Are you trying to work as an individual to see ways in which you can be um, a thorn in the side, like cause problems, slow things down, and like slow things down and protect people? Are you working as an individual to try and do that? Looking up ways, like I said, like things like malicious compliance, things as well of, oops, I lost a form, or I duplicated this paperwork, um, stuff like that. Also, just, I don't know. I don't know can also be a form of civil disobedience. If you are asked questions of, do you know who lives here? Or where was this information from certain places that you're concerned about, like what their intentions might be, you can go, I don't know who lives here. I don't know my neighbor's name. Um, Things like that. And that's sort of evergreen practices that can be really helpful. And I think too, looking back to history can be really good. Um, Even within the last decade, there have been a lot of things that have been done, both in the United States and around the world, that are forms of civil disobedience, and figuring out practices that you might want. I think also it can be useful to be think very big and broad about what civil disobedience is. Um, because there's also civil disobedience that may involve things like art, things like if people are very concerned about their image in certain ways, refusing to take that seriously. And yeah, that's again, disclaimer, ASAN cannot formally, like officially endorse forms of civil disobedience. I'm giving you examples from history, and I strongly encourage you to do your own research and decide. But I think anything that can be a resistance to a power or an authority that you feel is not acting in ways that are safe or just, is still worthwhile, even if, as we said, not everything feels like, as we talked about earlier, not everything will feel like an easy, like very obvious victory. Sometimes success looks like just stalling the gears. I really hope that it helped. Yeah. And I'm going to move to the next question we have from Jenna. Um, what are some ways to communicate information easily about the often harsh realities of the policy advocacy process to those who are not entrenched in the advocacy space, e.g., grassroots coalition members? So that's a great question. And also, there's not a clear, like, I often wish I had an answer that was just like an easy Lego brick that I could hand you and it fits. For a lot of these questions, I feel that way. Because the communication is going to need to be tailored to individuals. And also, I want to strongly encourage, I personally believe that advocacy work is multifaceted. So you need the folks who are really good at, like, you need the folks who are really, really good at the policy advocacy stuff, who have the patience for the ways in which policy advocacy often sees victories in little small steps as opposed to big jumps. Um, sorry, my camera is mirrored. Um, that is a different temperament than the folks who are very good at what we were just talking about, civil disobedience advocacy, because those are also different levels of risk, um, and they require different skill sets. So I think it's important too when you're working in grassroots. Sometimes it can be the thing of figuring out, like, because I think sometimes we get into a space where we feel like the civil disobedience folks and the policy advocacy folks um, are just like they can't work together. They're thinking about things too differently. But really, you are working together. Like you need both because speaking personally, I have found in my experience um, that the um, that having folks who are on the civil disobedience side, who are doing very public demonstrations, who are doing pressure campaigns, um, makes the folks who are willing to come and sit in the district office and be like, hi, we want to talk to you about stuff, suddenly seem much more appealing and folks are much more willing to listen. Um, Also, my colleague Dean is happy to hop in on this, so I'm going to open the floor to him for a minute.
Sure. So just from the comms side of like communicating information easily, I think that's the hardest part that you will get stuck up on. I think unfortunately, information that is clearly and freely and accessibly available for our communities is not going to be easy for those who are creating it. And that is just part of like knowing where and who should put effort towards certain things. So folks who are well versed in plain language and easy read materials, folks who know how to do captioning or create accessible short form videos, folks who know how to communicate on social media in a way that's going to get across to as many folks as possible in the most accessible way, should be focusing their energy on those things. Because often the folks who are really, really good at then like directly connecting with grassroots in person and organizing events and setting up meetings with offices um, aren't going to be well versed in those things. And um, that is why it is important to like build coalitions with folks who have different skills. And this is again purely from the just literally how do you communicate this stuff. Um, I think you find folks who are good at those specific skills and you kind of really focus on the things that you are good at. You know, you might have someone who the whole thing that they do is making sure everything is in plain language or easy read. And that is what they do, and that is wholly what they contribute, and it is truly so much to contribute.
Thank you, Dean. I really appreciate that. I think it's a really good addition. Um, And again, also, I think it's a thing of circling back into that space of reminding them that this is a long haul, um, and that that landscape looks really different, and that it's okay to like cycle in and out. Um, if you're starting to become burned out on that long haul trench, maybe you shift to a place where you're doing advocacy work from a different angle. Um, and we have one more question from an anonymous attendee. How do I keep myself safe when approaching representatives and policymakers who have expressed vitriol towards marginalized groups that I belong to? Are there strategies that I should use in those cases? Okay, that's a very good question. Um, and the answer sort of your mileage may vary, and a lot of it is about personal like your personal comfort threshold in addition to what is safety for you. And also vitriol being like um angry sentiments, cruel sentiments, um words that are like expressing the desire for certain groups to have fewer rights, that kind of stuff. That's what I believe we are talking about when we say the word vitriol. Um, and that can vary widely. Um, and your strategy on that can vary widely. Uh, I think sometimes, um, depending on the level of danger that you feel like is there, maybe you're not the one who should approach directly. Maybe that's a space, particularly, I'm going to again fall back on discussing immigration, because I live in a state that is, um, I live in Texas, and immigration rights come up fairly often in my state. Um, if you are speaking with, like, so let's using the example of immigration, if there's a legislator who has a very harsh attitude towards immigration, um, and maybe talks often about removing, like, making it harder to apply for refugee status, or making it harder to go through the immigration process. And you're anxious about meeting with them like directly, like maybe that does not need to be a place where an immigrant is meeting directly with that legislator one-on-one, like that legislator's office. Um, Maybe it's a space, like oftentimes organizing in groups to speak on, like, let's say I'm talking about this on the state level. Um, Really, like, organizing it, like an often used strategy is to organize in large groups. I've seen this done with trans rights in this state. I've seen it done with abortion rights in Texas, and I've also seen it done with immigration rights. Organizing in large groups and making it clear that there is not going to be a tolerance for for taking the most vulnerable members of those groups and trying to um, threaten them in some sort of way that could cause them harm, be that legal threats or something else. Um, Having that strategy, and again, also involving lawyers on that front. So it can be very clear of everybody knows their rights. Everybody knows that they have that legal protection. Because often when we're talking about, like, if we're concerned about safety, that's where that kind of danger will come from. Obvious, like, we are unlikely to be physically attacked by, like, representatives are not going to cause physical harm. Um, but there might, like, I know oftentimes people might be concerned of facing um, police intervention or ICE intervention, um, and building risk reduction there. Because maybe it's also the thing of Maybe testimonials are gathered. Again, circling back to that example of immigration, maybe testimonials are gathered and they are presented by folks who don't have to worry about that, who don't have to be afraid of being detained or deported. They bring in those testimonials, they speak for, they elevate that voice, and they also bring their own concerns with them. Um, that's kind of a way to do it. And I think also you don't, we don't necessarily need to do direct action. Um, we can do, we can still be involved in advocacy while doing support work. So maybe you're involved in networking or you use proxy caller systems. A proxy caller system is where someone calls the representative and delivers your message on your behalf. But I will name that a proxy caller system does still need you to give your name and usually something that shows that you are a part of that representative's like district or area, like your zip code, or your address. So if you're not comfortable with that, I wouldn't use that method. But yeah, I would say being involved in advocacy in a level where you don't have to be face to face, organizing again as a group, because that creates protection, because the more privileged members of the group can kind of come forward and create a barrier that reduces the risks for marginalized members. Because not everyone is in a position where they can take on that kind of risk. Not everyone wants to take on that kind of risk, and that's okay. I hope that helps. Then we have um, bit rebellious, delightful, who says, as a trans autistic and ADHD survivor of ABA, is there any way to make a positive difference for others with similar experiences? Actually, I think there's a lot of ways you could. It depends on what you are comfortable with, like what you're comfortable with, the kind of energy, like how much energy you have to give to that kind of stuff, and how much time and how much energy, and also what your skill set and interests are. To give examples off the top of my head, one, if you want to do policy advocacy work that interfaces with the government, when opportunities arise to speak on, if you want to talk about gender affirming care, the dangers of ABA, autism research, actual community actual useful accommodations, actual helpful healthcare interventions. If you're doing policy work, your public submitting public comments, giving testimonials if there's, say, locally, like town hall meetings, or federally when there's opportunities to speak, that kind of stuff. And those are things you can also find and connect by working with advocacy organizations. And again, thinking of, do you want to do that work state level? Do you want to do it nationally? Or do you want to do it locally and see what's going on in your city? Maybe folks are organizing locally to try and change. Maybe your school district currently is still pushing kids towards ABA, and you really don't want that to happen. Or maybe your school district is trying to keep trans kids from getting to use the public bathroom or play sports, because we're seeing a lot of that kind of legislation. You can get involved with local advocacy on those issues and see where you fit in. Maybe it's giving testimonials. Maybe it's providing support and speaking, doing education that actually uh, gets rid of a lot of the myths that are spread around autism and ADHD, as well as trans rights. Because certainly all of those communities face a lot of misinformation, stuff that's not true, but is unfortunately widely spread, so people don't actually understand our communities. If you want to focus less on the policy side of things and more on the community side of things, are there local support groups that you could be a part of? are there, and also that truly depends too on like what stage you're at in processing your own experiences, because uh excuse, excuse me. Um, because those experiences obviously have an impact on us as individuals when we go through them. But like seeing if there's support groups where you can share your experience, and also like particularly when we're like focusing on the ABA side, um, when we've gone through that kind of thing, the recovery point, it can be a really important and healing thing to see folks who are further along in their journey and have learned, like, have found ways to unlearn that, like unlearn the sort of violence of ABA and the stuff that they were taught and the ways they were taught to hide part of themselves. Um, like seeing someone who's further along in recovering from that can be really healing and really supportive and give a sense of hope of like, you're in pain right now. The pain will not always be the same. Things change. And I think that is true as well for like the trans community, and seeing older trans folks who are at different stages of transition, getting to talk to each other, getting to see like, oh, okay, like things are really things are really hard at the stage I'm at, but like there is community, there is connection, there is hope. So that's also a front you can do it more on the social community aspect than on the policy aspect. I hope that helps. Um, and then we're almost at time, but I see there's one more. I'm going to try and answer and not take an age and a half. Um, I'm an MSW student in my second year of my graduate program in Florida. I believe I am autistic and now work with kids on the spectrum at my internship. I'm trying to identify the difference between appropriate and safe discipline for kids versus harmful and abusive methods that came from ABA therapy. Do you have any book recommendations for ethical methods of education and setting limits with kids on the spectrum that don't oppress them and their natural behaviors? Oof. That is, that's a very good question. I'm really glad that you're thinking of this. I'm glad that you want to change that work, because I know ABA is still very forward. And I am an MSW myself, and I also know that widespread education in Masters of Social Work programs still, if it even talks about autism and supporting autistic communities, uh outside of like at all, it's rarely outside of ABA. uh so I appreciate that you want to do that work. um if my team members have recommendations for books, uh please drop them in the chat. I off the cuff, like I would say focus like the goal is not to, okay, there we go. Thank you so much. So Dean has posted in the chat for whose benefit, evidence, ethics, and effectiveness of autism interventions, as well as firsthand perspectives on behavioral interventions for autistic people and people with other developmental disabilities. And then our like these are all resources that ASAN has created. And then we have beyond coercion and institution, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the need for improved behavioral services. Um, so these are not exactly what you're asking for, because I think you're asking for therapeutic interventions, and that's a little tougher right now. Um, but these can give you a good place to start because they are informed by autistic people's experiences. They are written by autistic people, and they can give you like a bouncing point from there. Because the thing is, like, ABA, we know, is a traumatizing practice. Um, And there are like methods do exist to help autistic kids learn how to regulate, like how to regulate ourselves, like autistic people, how to regulate ourselves, how to, um, there's also work around how do we accommodate kids? Because oftentimes the behaviors that are viewed as bad are kids who are getting overwhelmed in their environment, who feel overwhelmed, who have needs that are not being met, who are uncomfortable, or like the environment is not adapting to them, and ABA forces kids to try and adapt to that environment. as opposed to shifting um, the environment to actually be accommodating, which is a big point of disability rights is accommodations. There we go. Thank you so much, Dean. Dean has said Thinking Person's Guide to Autism has some great resources on this more specifically and is highly recommended in general. Please do check out Thinking Person's Guide to Autism as well as the resources that Dean has posted in the chat. And let me see. We're almost at time. We have one more person who's posted. Besa said, Hi, I'm an adult with autism who became a Buddhist and a humanist chaplain to be able to navigate systems and do my work as an advocate and community organizer. But I would love to support people and organizations in the autism community with weekly programming and support. I think I think that's a really good thing. I don't think we can be I would love to find a community that has too many resources in terms of like weekly programming and support, but I have yet to discover that. So I think it's great to start those kind of things. I think a good place to start can actually be figuring out what's already happening in your state and what might already be happening in your community. For example, also hi Besa, because I believe you are in fact one of our affiliates. So thank you so much for coming today. Um, but a good place to start too can be looking at what other support groups might be existing in your state. Um, yes, you are like if you're wanting to build more programming, I think look at existing models. Look at existing models. I would also suggest I will reach out to you actually, because our affiliate network includes other groups that are doing support groups. And if you're hoping to like I can't, your question to me implies that you want to expand the work that you're already doing. And if you're looking for that, I think connecting with our other affiliates, particularly we have one over in California that's been running support groups for a few years. Um, if you're wanting to expand that, I think maybe doing some crosswork with them. Please feel free to email me to follow up on that. And I'm really glad because you're doing great work already in your community. I'm really happy that you're wanting to expand on that. With that, we are actually at time today. And I want to say once again, thank you to everybody who's joined us. I've really appreciated you taking this journey with us. I really appreciate the fact that you want to do advocacy in your community, that you want to do policy advocacy. We always need people doing this work. Um, we get through this together. We make change together because our communities deserve, again, places where we can thrive, live, and grow. Thank you again for your time, and I hope you have a good afternoon, um, a good day, and a good weekend. Take care.